Let's talk about the Roman Republic's chaotic final decades. We've got civil wars, massive scandals, and generals with egos the size of Gaul. And right in the middle of it all, you have the Senate. But here's the big question we're digging into today. Was the Senate this mighty, powerful institution fighting tooth and nail for its survival, or was it just a hollow shell, a paper tiger whose power was nothing more than an illusion?
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. Think of it like a debate. We're going to look at the Senate's traditional authority, then hear the arguments for its strength, and then the arguments for its weakness. We'll dive into the age of warlords, see how it all came crashing down, and then finally try to reach a verdict on where power really came from in late Republican Rome.
All right, first things first. We need to get our heads around what the Senate's power was even supposed to be. See, it wasn't based on some written constitution like we'd have today. It was built on something fuzzier.
And that fuzzy thing had a name, Auctoritas. This is so key. It wasn't about laws on a page. It was this immense traditional authority. It was the collective weight, the prestige of Rome's most important families, and this deep, unspoken understanding that what the Senate said, well, it went.
And you know what? For centuries, that was enough. The Senate really was, for all intents and purposes, the real head of state. People respected it. But by the time we get to our period, around 88 BC, that respect was starting to wear thin. You could already see the cracks forming in the foundation.
So with that in mind, let's look at the case for the Senate. Let's make the argument that it could still flex its muscles, because there were definitely moments where it looked like the old guard was back in charge and they weren't messing around.
And Exhibit A is the dictator Sulla. The historian Appian tells us Sulla launched this full-on political blitz. He didn't just tweak the system, he re-engineered the whole state to put the Senate back on top. He packed it with his buddies, weakened his rivals, and completely declawed the tribunes. For a little while, you could argue the Senate seemed stronger than ever.
And then you get this moment in 63 BC. This is a brilliant example of a Senate in command. Guided by Cicero, the Senate moves decisively to crush a conspiracy to overthrow the government. They issue what's called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which is basically a declaration of martial law, and they execute state enemies without a trial. This was the Senate acting as the supreme defender of Rome. So, case closed, right?
Well, not quite. But was this strength real, or was it just a performance? The counterargument is, frankly, devastating, because it points to a totally new kind of power that Auctoritas just couldn't compete with.
See, a little before our period, a guy named Marius completely changed the army. He turned it into a professional force, and this was probably the single biggest crack in the Republic's foundation. Why? Because these new soldiers weren't loyal to the Senate or to Rome. They were loyal to the general who paid them, who promised them land when they retired. Their loyalty was bought and paid for.
And what's so fascinating is you can see how generals started talking to the Senate. Just listen to this. This is Pompey writing from Spain, and the historian Sallust recorded it. This isn't a request, it's a threat. He's basically saying, fund my army or I'm bringing them back to Italy and you can deal with them yourselves. He was reminding them who held the real power.
So let's jump ahead to the 50s BC, because this is where everything really builds to a climax. This is the moment the Senate basically becomes a spectator in its own republic.
And that brings us to the first triumvirate. Now, this wasn't an official position. It was a secret backroom deal between the three biggest players in Rome, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. They decided they were just going to carve up the state for themselves.
And just look at this. Each of them wanted something the Senate had said no to. Pompey wanted land for his soldiers. Crassus wanted a sweet deal for his business buddies. Caesar wanted a big military command to go make a name for himself. So what did they do? They just went around the Senate. Caesar, acting as consul, used his power to force their whole agenda into law. They just completely ignored the system.
So how did they get away with it? Well, it all comes down to a number, 10. In his own account of the Civil War, Caesar says his rival Pompey claimed to have 10 legions ready to go. 10 legions. We're talking about 50,000 hardened professional soldiers loyal only to him. And that brings us to the new math of power in Rome.
So here it is, the billion-dollar question. Can you vote against 10 legions? Does the Senate's traditional moral authority, its auctoritas, mean anything when faced with that kind of overwhelming military force? A decree from the Senate is just a piece of paper to a guy with a sword.
The Civil War that came next was the ultimate stress test for the Senate. It was the moment the whole illusion just shattered, and the raw truth about power in Rome was laid bare for everyone to see.
You'd think Caesar's assassination, this desperate act by senators to restore the Republic, would have worked. But it failed, spectacularly. It didn't bring back the good old days, it just kicked off an even more brutal civil war.
In the middle of all this chaos, the Senate tried to make one last defiant stand. They tried to tell Caesar's young heir, this kid named Octavian, that he couldn't be consul. He was too young, too dangerous. They tried to put their foot down and say, no.
But Octavian's response was simple and final. As the historian Suetonius tells it, he just marched his army on Rome. One of his officers strode into the Senate house, pulled back his cloak to show the hilt of his sword, and said, "If you do not make him consul, this will." That's it. The threat of violence was all it took. The debate was over. The Senate folded.
So what's our final takeaway from this incredible collapse? What does it all tell us about the real nature of power in the late Republic?
Well, the history of these decades is really the story of this brutal switch. It's a move away from a system based on tradition and respect, auctoritas, to a new system based entirely on who had the biggest army. The Senate had influence, sure, but guys like Pompey, Caesar, and finally Octavian, they had imperium, the power of command, and in the end, imperium always won.
And that really leaves us with one final big question to chew on. Was the Senate just a victim here, helpless against this new breed of warlord? Or did its own corruption, its endless infighting, and its total failure to solve Rome's real problems make its collapse completely inevitable? That's a debate that historians are still having today.